Most people agree that liberty is something important, but what is liberty? You are not free if you are forced to pick cotton day after day, but you are still unfree if you are forced to work for a boss and rent from a landlord because you cannot have a piece of land where you can run your own business or build your own home. Geoism is the recognition that people have equal rights to what nature provides for free, such as land. Geoism gives us a framework for building a better society with both freedom and equality. Not only can houses be affordable, but people can also have much more freedom to choose their own lifestyle. In this podcast, we explore the friendliest flavor of liberty. Martin Jacobson is a political theorist who lives in Sweden and works at the University of Upsala. Martin has spent several years exploring the relationship between Geoism and liberty. This year he earned his PhD with a dissertation titled Land and Liberty. Martin, thank you for being here. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me, Martin. I'm great.
Martin, I am glad you're here because you know everything about liberty. Access to natural resources is an important ingredient of liberty, but today we will discuss liberty in an even broader sense. Following orders is not what makes life worth living. And if a certain place in the world becomes unfree, usually the people who live there will be unhappy and hungry. Martin, why do you think liberty is something very important?
I strongly agree with what you said, and I think that we can distinguish between several different ways of dividing the reasons for liberty. So partly, you can talk about the intrinsic reasons why liberty is important. It's important in and of itself. But you could also think about the positive consequences which follow from liberty. And I think both of these contribute to justifying why liberty is so important. I think that we can provide at least three different reasons why I believe that liberty is important. So one is that liberty is important in and of itself because it connects to our fundamental dignity as persons. We are autonomous beings which have the ability to choose for ourselves what we want to do and strive for and try to achieve. And when someone deprives us of our liberty by coercing us, they also deprive us of this ability to choose our own ends. They are treating us just as a means to their ends rather than as a mean in of our own. And I think that this is something which is just fundamentally wrong. A second reason why I think that liberty is important is that it is connected to equality. So I think that a really important idea is that everyone is born free and equal. And equality also means that other peoples are not yours to boss around, and they should not be subjected to your authority. I think that authority, as the opposition to liberty, automatically implies that there are some people who would be bosses and other people who would be following orders. And this, by default, introduces a form of non-egalitarian relationship between these people. And I think that this is wrong in itself, but it also tends to lead to a lot of bad consequences. It leads to the bosses often taking decisions which are good for themselves, whereas they are bad for the people who are bossed around. And this brings me to the third reason why I think that liberty is important, is that I think that it broadly leads to good consequences for people. In general, I believe that people will try to make the best of the situation they find themselves in. People will choose the best opportunity or option that they have available. And that means that when you reduce the number of choices that people have available, then you will also probably make them worse because you take away things that could have been good for them. Or if you take away something which they wouldn't have used, you're certainly not making them better off. And that means that as long as people consent to do something, I think that it's usually reasonable to infer that they're doing so because this is something which they believe is good for them. And if two people are consenting to interact with each other, then we should also, unless there's very strong evidence against this, assume that they do so because this is good for both of them. So by forbidding this, we would forbid them from both improving their situation. And reversely, if people do not consent to interacting in some way, then we should presume that this is because they are not benefited by this, that they are harmed by this interaction. And if we believe that flourishing of everyone is valuable, then we shouldn't try to harm people.
Great. So liberty is something important. And then the next question is even more complicated, because what do you think is the best way to define liberty? What is liberty?
That's a really big and important question. So there are many different ways to define liberty. One influential distinction made by Esai Berlin is that between positive and negative liberty. And what he argued with this is that positive liberty, or positive freedom, is the ability to achieve a certain specific end, whereas negative liberty is the ability or the freedom not to be coerced or hindered by someone else. And I think that both of these are important, and I shouldn't want to say that we should completely disregard one of those. But the one which tends to be more centered for my theorizing is negative liberty. And one reason why I believe that negative liberty is really important is that I believe that everyone should have the freedom to choose for themselves what they want to achieve in the world, what they want to strive for. And with positive liberty, there's often a predefined liberty to achieve a certain end. And this automatically limits what you are able to do with your liberty. So I think that negative liberty is much more open-ended than positive liberty. And since I believe that there's not one single correct way to live, but rather that every individual should have the freedom to decide for themselves how they want to live, I tend to favor more negative accounts of liberty. Secondly, I think of liberty as something which is essentially interpersonal. So very often we are unable to achieve the different things that we want to do. So we lack positive liberty due to factors which are ultimately not due to any wrongdoing for any person. And while I think that this is sad and regrettable in many ways, I don't see that as unjust. I think of injustice as arising primarily where one person mistreats another one, and thinking of liberty as particularly arising when you hinder other people from exercising their rights encapsulates this fundamentally interpersonal aspect of liberty.
Maybe some people use the term positive liberty in order to justify a large government with lots of taxes and regulation. We would need this to have the libraries and universities we need for our positive liberty. However, I think negative liberty is an essential ingredient of positive liberty. Many people would better flourish if they had the option to run their own business, to design and build their own house, to decide for themselves how they want to organize things, etc. Regulation makes it almost impossible for many people to do these things. We should not underestimate how this lack of negative liberty also affects our positive liberty.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. And I think that very important in this sense is that it comes down to the question of who should have the ability to decide what is actually in our interests. Should it be the government who decide what is in our interest, or should it be each person deciding what is in our interests? Mm-hmm. And I believe that one problem with centralizing authority to government is that then you deprive people of the ability to determine their own interests in a way which I believe is unjust and harmful.
Yeah, and then a central government prescribes what is a good life, and people don't have the option to choose their own lifestyle. Another definition I found in your dissertation is people should be free to opt out of unwanted interactions. Is that a similar way of defining liberty?
I think that this is a really important core feature of liberty. What I like about it is that it encapsulates this idea of liberty being something interpersonal, and that it is about being able to choose which associations or interactions which we want to be part of. I think that this connects back to the idea that people, by and large, tend to choose to act in ways which they believe would be beneficial to themselves. And when you coerce someone into an interaction without their consent, that should be seen as a sign that you're not doing it in their interests. If this actually was in their interest, you could have just asked for their consent. And the fact that they don't want to consent to this should be taken as strong evidence that it's not in their actual interest.
So our common sense may work quite well. If people cry, "No, leave me alone," it might be better to leave them alone. Today we still see a society with where large governments and huge amounts of regulation are something very normal. Why do you think most people don't protest against large governments and against coercion?
I believe that there are many different reasons why people are skeptical about this form of liberty. And perhaps the most common one would be that they are worried that it will lead to terrible outcomes in different ways. So either that it will lead to systematic inequality, that it will lead to widespread suffering among groups, or that it will lead to conflict since we're unable to cooperate. When you reflect upon it, very few people would say that they are against liberty as such, but rather I think that they would say that they are for other things which might be in conflict with liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And I happen to think that while there certainly can be trade-offs in theoretical scenarios, in practice, very often, these different ends tend to come together. So I believe that liberty and equality are fundamentally not at odds with each other, but rather that they are mutually supporting. And part of the reason why we want liberty is because it also leads to equality. So I disagree with this view, which is one of the common arguments against individual liberty. I think there's unusual that people say, I don't want to be free. It's rather that they want to restrict the freedom of other people. I think that very few people would say that they personally would behave really, really horribly against their fellow people if they had the opportunity, but they tend to be skeptical about other people and judge them by harsher standards. And I think that might be one of the reasons why people are skeptical about freedom. It's not only that they don't want to be free themselves, but they are afraid of what other people would do if they were less restricted. I think that another potential psychological aspect of this is that I believe that for many people it is kind of terrifying to believe that no one is in charge. And I believe that this might be one reason why people accept conspiratorial thinking. Terrifying as it would be if there was an evil conspiracy controlling the world, they still think that this would be better if there's no one actually controlling the world, because we are still just influenced by different processes where there is no central agency deciding exactly what will happen. And I think this might be one of the reasons why people are skeptical of liberty. They see it as terrifying that no single person is in charge and could actually decide to change society overnight. Whereas I believe that many more libertarian-oriented people tend to see society as the outcome of spontaneous order, where there's no single person in charge.
Yeah, spontaneous order. That's what I prefer as well. Perhaps it's time to talk about some great people of the 19th century. And the first one is Lysander Spooner. I will quote a little from his work. Okay, this is from Lysander Spooner's Natural Law or the Science of Justice. Although it is the right of anybody to repel injustice and compel justice for themselves and for all who may be wronged, yet to avoid the errors that are liable to result from haste and passion, it's evidently desirable that men should associate, so far as they freely and voluntarily can do. Yet such associations can be rightful and desirable only insofar as they are purely voluntary. No man can be rightfully coerced into joining one. And I think that's very interesting, because Lysander Spooner doesn't tell us just abolish the state and start acting as individuals and then the world will become better. But he tells us that it's very important to think about justice and to work together to promote justice. He only opposes the idea of a coercive state, the idea that we should be forced to join association What do you think about Lysander Spooner's ideas?
Yeah, I tend to be a big admirer of Lysander Spooner, and I think that he has written a lot of interesting and inspiring text. And I very much sympathize with this idea that social cooperation is fundamental to us as a social species, and I think that it's certainly something which we should strive for. However, when these interactions become non-voluntary and we are unable to opt out from them, they risk to become abusive. So we should really make sure that all of our social cooperation is also voluntary. And I think that Lysander Spooner expresses this beautifully in the passage you just read. I think Lysander Spooner is really fascinating both as a thinker but also as an activist. So he partly wrote long theses about why he was skeptical about state authority. And I highly recommend reading, for example, his treatise No Treason, on why not acting along with the US Constitution would not constitute treason. But he's also famous for running a number of different experiments in which he tried to oppose state authority in practice. For example, he started his own post company competing with the national monopoly on postal services and was able to significantly bring down the costs of sending letters until he was then coercively shut down by the state. Mm-hmm. He also had a kind of strange but also a fascinating idea for how to abolish slavery in the American South. And his plan was that he was going to secretly purchase all of the slaves in the state of Texas, and then emancipate them all at once. And then the slaveholders would be unable to counteract this movement because it would all go at one occasion. And that, well, was obviously never put into practice. But I think that he is very inspiring for seeking to combine both this theoretical aspects with actually trying to implement these ideals in practice.
Yeah, running a mail service as a way to annoy the government. Spooner also wrote about the issue of land ownership. I will still read a small quote from it's from the same essay. In the process of time, the robber or slaveholding class began to discover that the easiest mode of managing their slaves was to give them the responsibility of their own subsistence and yet compel them to sell their labor to the landholding class, their former owners. Of course, the liberated slaves, having no lands or other property and no means of obtaining an independent subsistence, had no alternative but to sell their labor to the landholders in exchange only for the coarsest necessities of life.
I think that in some places he is actually more a right-libertarian with regards to land ownership. So it might be either that he differs in different parts of his writing, that he sort of changes his ideas over time. But in particular, there's one book from the 1850s, which, let's see if I can find it, The Law of Intellectual Property, where he partly defends intellectual property rights and partly, I think, defends some form of right-libertarian views on land ownership.
Okay, so Lysander Spooner was not 100% left-libertarian, but he wrote some great things. I think the next person to discuss should be Benjamin Tucker. Martin, could you introduce Benjamin Tucker to our listeners?
Yeah, so Benjamin Tucker, he was a American anarchist or individualist anarchist who lived in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And he is most famous for being the editor of a journal called Liberty, which he wrote significantly in himself, but also invited a lot of the important thinkers of the time to write in. So it was a really important forum for libertarian-minded ideals.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin Tucker is usually categorized as an individualist anarchist, market anarchist, or maybe a libertarian socialist. What kind of liberty did he promote?
So Tucker, like many people, he changed somewhat during his lifetime in exactly how he tried to frame the underlying ethics of his ideal. He started out as a natural rights theorist and later became influenced by Max Stirner and became increasingly more nihilistic in his metaethics, or egoistic. But on another level, his main argument was influenced by, I think, two main strains. And one is the American abolitionist tradition resisting slavery. So this abolitionist tradition, they saw slavery as the paradigmatic case of what is wrong in society. And the main case of this would, of course, be chattel slavery in the American South. But they thought that these features of chattel slavery, which they rejected, that one person can take the labor of another person and keep them in bondage and oppression, that this is something which actually existed all over society, but in smaller scales. And they also applied this to governments. So for the same reason that it would be wrong for the slave owner to take the fruits of the labor from the slave or the enslaved person, it would be wrong for the government to take earnings from people without their consent. So for this individualist anarchist tradition, it very much grows out of this abolitionist streak. A second really important influence comes from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a French thinker in the early 20th century or early 19th century, and he's famous for being the first person who referred to himself as an anarchist. And Proudhon, he is notable for developing an economic theory known as mutualism, which would share many different features with socialism, but also with free market economics. So it shared with the socialist ideal that the workers should be able to keep the full earnings of their labor, and the idea that they are currently being cheated or exploited out of this value. But it also contributed with the argument that under a completely free market, which was independent of different privileges and distortions laid upon it by the government, the full value of a person's labor would be reflected in his wage. So without these different distortions, wages would increase and prices would fall, thereby benefiting laborers. So it wanted to achieve different socialist ends, but seeing the market as the best means to do so.
So in contrast with most socialists today, Benjamin Tucker believed that the free market was something good. He believed government created and government enforced monopolies were the main cause of most problems in society.
So Benjamin Tucker, he famously expressed it as being four main problematic monopolies which should be opposed. One was the patents and different intellectual property rights, which would in different ways impede people from producing freely. So these patents, they just give a monopoly right to whoever holds this patent to be the only one producing this particular good, and thereby reducing competition while increasing profits for the monopoly holder and prices for all the customers and clients.
And then we could imagine that the workers in the factory are unable to set up their own factory because they don't have the patent. And the consumers, if they think that they need to pay too much, are unable to produce their own goods, also because they don't have the patent.
Yeah, I agree so. And I think that this is perhaps most clear today in the different forms of medical fields, where different drugs are patented to the point where they become extremely much more costly on the market compared to their actual production cost. So in principle, other competitors could start producing the same drug and sell it at a price far below what is currently on the market. And what is preventing them from doing so is the fact that this is illegal, that it's only the patent holder who is allowed to do this. And the ideal then would be that if these patents were removed, these drugs would be possible to produce at their production cost. And this would reduce profits towards zero, so it would remove profits from wealthy capitalists, while it would also make these drugs much cheaper for consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other monopolies according to Tucker?
So the second monopoly, which Tucker discussed, is the protectionist tariffs of different countries. So during this time, one of the largest bases of taxes for different countries were to tax imports of goods from other countries. And what this did is they protected local producers against competition from international competitors, but it thereby also increased prices for consumers who would otherwise have been able to acquire these goods much more cheaply from abroad. So it increased cost while also benefiting some people at the expense of others. And this Tucker would also see as an unjustified monopoly.
Yeah. And then the banking monopoly was one of Tucker's favorites.
Yes, so to the mutualist tradition, the banking monopoly was crucial, and it's probably the most significant one according to this mutualist theory. And the argument from these mutualists is that having access to credit and capital is a good like others. That when you are able to do this completely freely, then the only cost for doing so will be the different natural costs, which come from actually having laborers who work the bank, actually take into account different risks which you accrue with this lending. But they saw this natural interest rate as very low compared to actual interest rates. And they argued that the actual interest rates, which are imposed by the fact that you are not allowed to start your own bank and sell and lend to whatever rate you would want to, that raises interest rates much above their natural rate. And this creates interest profits for the different people who have access to this monopoly, to these privileges, so for people connected to the banking and finance world. But it also makes it much more difficult for workers to access capital, and since they don't have access to capital, they become dependent upon capitalists. So that was their main explanation for why you had this major class division between capitalists and workers in the society, that one group was able to monopolize access to capital, whereas the other group was deprived of access to these resources which they needed to produce.
Yeah. So Tucker would allow you and me to set up our own bank if we want to, unhindered by regulation.
Yes, exactly. So they defended free banking, not in the positive sense of liberty that everyone should have their own bank, but rather in the negative sense that free banking is similar to free speech, that it's wrong to stop people from starting a new bank if they so want to, and if all the clients would go there voluntarily. And their argument is that if you would have free banking in the same sense as free speech, and you find that all the current banks are scamming people, then it would be possible to create a new bank which does not have this form of scamming, thereby reducing usurious interest rates towards zero, thereby benefiting laborers and people who need access to capital. So thereby market pressure would reduce interest rates towards nothing.
Yeah. Now, and the final monopoly is the favorite one of the Geoists, I think, the land monopoly.
Among many of these individualist anarchists and mutualists, they agree that absentee land ownership is a major problem and a major root of economic inequality and exploitation. And the way that I wanted to combat this is what they call occupancy and use criteria of property. And the ideal here is that you are able to possess land and other resources as long as you are actively using them. But as soon as you stop using them or give them over to someone else who would then be the user, you lose your claim to these resources. So you can only accumulate as much as you are able to actually use. And this would have two immediate effects. One of them is that people who are tenants, who are actually using these resources, they would get a title to it as well. So absentee landlords, they would lose all the land to their tenants instead, who would become the new legitimate owners of them. And another one is that it would ensure that all the land which is not currently in use by anyone would be free for taking for anyone who would like to use it. So it would open up it for to appropriate for anyone who wanted. And these mutualist and individualist anarchists, they believed that this effect of occupancy of use, it would be able to address many of the problems which Georgists recognized, but without having some problems which they saw with the Georgist single tax on land. So they were very wary that taxation in general would be problematic and that it would prop up a strong government which could be a threat to individual liberty rather than support of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I think Tucker was right to some extent. Governments are not always good at protecting individual liberty. So it would be great to resolve the land question in a simple way with no government. But I would expect some issues if we would just implement occupancy and use, for instance, if we leave our home for a holiday. I think it would be great to compare Tucker's idea of liberty with that of contemporary right-wing or conservative libertarians. So left versus right libertarianism. What is the difference between them?
So I think that on a direct ethics point concerning which actions are legitimate and which are illegitimate, there is a lot of agreement between these different ideologies. And their main difference might come down to how they see legitimate possession over land, whether you need to have this perpetual use of it or ongoing use of it in order to have a legitimate claim to it. But I think that there are some larger differences which does not come down to just saying when is coercion justified or not justified. Historically, the movement for individual liberty was often perceived as part of the wider movement of the political left, fighting to abolish privileges and monopoly while promoting equality among all. And I think that this is clear where Benjamin Tucker identified in many ways as a socialist, and several of these people in the early individualist anarchist scene were also members of the Workers' International movement. So they saw their allies as being the socialist part of the left. One thing which happens during the 20th century is that with the Russian Revolution and the spread of state socialistic Bolshevism, libertarians tend to become much more skeptical towards socialism and increasingly try to ally with conservatives. And in doing so, they tend to give up a lot of their social libertarian ideals and move towards a more conservative direction. And this is something which has been known as fusionism, the idea that you ought to fusion conservatism with libertarian ideals. And this is something which becomes a quite strong coalition, at least in American politics, during the Cold War era. And now after the end of the Cold War, it is less obvious that this is something which will be pursued by libertarians in the future.
Okay, yeah. So two flavors of libertarianism, the ones who want to promote socialist ideals, better condition for working class people, and so on, and the ones who are from the conservative tradition, who want to keep the difference between the working class and the class possessing the land and the factories and everything else.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe that's also the right place to discuss how to define left libertarianism, because I think left libertarianism is the one from the socialist kind of tradition. How would you define left-wing libertarianism?
So there are a few different ways that the word left libertarianism is used, and it might be worthwhile to pull these apart. So sometimes left libertarianism is used as a synonym for Georgism, basically. The idea that everyone has a full right to themselves, a form of self-ownership, which is often seen as indicative of libertarianism. combined with the idea that everyone has equal rights to natural resources, which would then be a form of left libertarianism as opposed to right libertarianism. A second way that left libertarianism is often used is to refer to the entire version of socialism that is not hierarchical or focused around the state. So here you could include things like syndicalism or anarcho-communism, which is in general a more horizontalist attitude toward socialism. A third sense, which I think connects very well to Tucker and to the individualist anarchists, is to see left libertarianism as the view that you try to achieve the traditional ends of the left or of socialism with the means which are most associated with libertarianism, so with individual property rights and with markets. And I think that this would include mutualists. It would also include many Georgists. So I think that Georgism tends to be left libertarianism often in more than one sense, also including this last form. Relatedly, many left libertarians in this third sense, they tend to identify left libertarianism with resistance towards different forms of hierarchy, partly in the form of authority, but also other types of domination. So for the same type which they believe that you should reject domination in the form of aggression or violence, they also believe that you should reject hierarchy in the form of sexism or racism. So they tend to extend the argument and share many of the ends of the radical left.
And I think both left and right-wing libertarians also promote the non-aggression principle, that you should not initiate force. But right libertarians focus on the problem that taking away or limiting property rights of landowners is a way of initiating force, where left libertarians have a different view on earth ownership, and therefore the left libertarians focus on sharing the earth in some kind of equal way, and right libertarians focus on protecting property rights. And why are the left libertarians right?
Well, depends on which version of left libertarianism you're talking about right now.
Yeah, we have three of them. Yeah. I myself, I prefer the first or the third version you explained, because I think the second one is in some ways problematic. How do you think about that?
I tend to agree. My own work tends to focus on the first and third versions, but I think that there are important insights to be learned from the second one as well. And it's certainly a tradition which I think that we should seek to be in dialogue with and to learn from as much as we can. One reason why I believe that the Georgist version of left libertarianism 1, is correct, is that I believe that the same considerations which make us reject aggression and subjugation of other person, so the same reasons why people argue that everyone should have a right to themselves, also gives you strong reasons to be skeptical of land ownership. And this would be most clear if we imagine situations in which some people are completely deprived of any access to land. George gives us an interesting thought experiment in which 100 people are locked on an isolated island, and there is one person who is either allowed to own the entire island, or he would own the other 99 persons. And what George argues is that regardless whether he owns the other persons or only owns the island, he would have complete authority over them, and they would be completely subjugated to his will. So if we argue that it is wrong to subjugate people in one of these situations, it seems to generalize to both cases. So I believe that this is important because it gives libertarians reasons to also be Georgist and to be left libertarians, not out of external or third considerations, but rather due to their internal commitments.
Yes, libertarians believe in self-ownership. People should be free to choose how to live and with who to interact. Or maybe some people don't want to interact at all, preferring to grow their own food and build their own house. If someone else owns all the land, this is impossible. In that situation, your only option is to work for the landowner and rent a place to live from the landowner. And that is not compatible with self-ownership. I think the next two persons to compare are Benjamin Tucker and Henry George. I think both promote liberty and believe that land ownership can be problematic. However, Tucker promotes the stateless solution, and George was, I think, in favor of a small government and a land value tax. And in his 1883 book, Social Problems, he even wrote, to prevent the government from becoming corrupt and tyrannous, its organization and methods should be as simple as possible, its functions be restricted to those necessary to the common welfare, and all its parts it should be kept as close to the people and as directly within their control as may be. So Henry George was also really against a big government, and therefore I think the ideas of Benjamin Tucker and Henry George were in the same direction. However, in his book Individual Liberty, Benjamin Tucker is very negative about Henry George. Do you know why?
So I think that there could be two different reasons why Tucker would be very skeptical of George. And one could be that since they are similar in many ways, they would also be competing for the same audience, the same group of readers who were attracted to this form of left-libertarianism. So since they were competitors, it was also perhaps natural for Tucker to be a bit suspicious of it. Another possible explanation is that Tucker was deeply skeptical about state authority, and perhaps justifiably so. And he was worried that Georgism would lend a cloak of legitimacy to states, which he did not want to give these states. So he saw Georgism potentially as dangerous in having this legitimizing role and maybe undermining his anti-authoritarian state skepticism. So that could be another possible explanation for this hostility which he had towards Georgism. I think that some of his arguments could be more persuasive than others. In particular, if you think about Georgism merely as the idea that states should amass or centralize rents and then use these rents for whatever they see fit, this would still deprive people of access to rents and equal access to land. So to paraphrase, he says something like this. The Georgist argument is that this street corner, it belongs to everyone, and therefore the government should take its revenue. It is similar to saying, this pocket belongs to you, and therefore I should put it in my pocket. So if you make a strong distinction between the state and between everyone, or between society, then it seems like having the state take these rents is just as bad as having any other type of landlord takes these rents. In a way, Tucker was worried that George would not really abolish land ownership, but would rather ensure that the state would become one massive landowner and that no one would have free access to land because the state would have monopolized all of it. And I think that this is a worry which Georges should take seriously. We can certainly imagine situations under which governments centralize access to land, also depriving people of this access, which we see as the end goal of Georgism.
Yeah, I agree. People are only free if they can have some natural resources such as land, and just a land value tax doesn't guarantee that they will have that kind of access. And maybe we could the main difference is the difference between people who believe that we can have some kind of reasonable, a good government, and some people who think that governments are always bad and that we just should get rid of any kind of government. So, Martin, we just discussed the difference between left and right-wing libertarianism, and we also discussed the difference between the ideas of Benjamin Tucker and Henry George. And yeah, both make some sense, but there are some differences between them. Do you have a suggestion how a society could best be organized in order to promote liberty, true liberty?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And I want to caveat my response, though, with saying that I believe that our society could be immensely improved, but it's often very hard to know with a great deal of confidence what very, very different worlds would be like. So I think that it's useful to try to imagine very different worlds, but I think that it's important to know our limitations in having great deals of confidence in these discussions, since we know so little about what the world would be like in these circumstances. One thing which has been really influential to my thinking, or two things which have been really influential to my thinking, is both the left-libertarian theories of Henry George. So the idea that people have rights to themselves and equal rights to the earth, combined with a deep skepticism about authority. And this skepticism about authority, it's partly a moral argument, to the point that I don't think that states have stronger rights than other actors have. I think that if it's wrong for people in general to do something, it would be wrong for states to do so as well. And partly, I think that we should be worried about states becoming abusive due to the fact that they are monopolistic. I think that there are inherent features in monopoly which tends to breed different types of abuse. And if we believe that this is a general feature of monopoly and define states as monopolies of violence, then we should also expect that these abusive tendencies could also arise in government. And I believe that the anarchist literature provides really interesting arguments around how one could try to get around these problems. And they argue that the same way that we get away from other types of monopoly by competition, we should also try to avoid the state monopoly by having competition in the provision of the different services which the state is currently providing. Mm-hmm. And this raises a really interesting question: to what extent it would be possible to reconcile these two different traditions? To what extent would it be possible to ensure that everyone has their equal claim to the earth without having one monopolized entity making this provision or ensuring everyone this equal rights? So this is something which has been part of my own research agenda and something which I tried to explore on a theoretical level, where I try to discuss different types of problems or models of doing this in a non-centralized way, and try to discuss different country institutions which would enable people to achieve these ends without having a centralized state. So, for example, one problem would be, how do we ensure that everyone actually pays the land rent for the land they are occupying and using? We need some form of enforcement mechanism, as long as people are not just going to do this out of their own goodwill. And traditionally, Georgists think that it should be the state which enforces this. And I try to consider whether it would be possible to have different decentralized non-state mechanisms for achieving this. Mm-hmm. So this is something which I discuss at length, particularly in the 7th chapter of my thesis, where I try to go from a very high level of abstraction into some more specific types of application. And I think that we can make some progress on these type of questions. But I also think that we currently, even though we can explore to some extent theoretically, it is difficult to have full confidence in what the absolutely best possible stable institution would be like. So I think I have some suggestions which I would be very happy if it was possible to implement them, but I have not 100% confidence that they would be possible to implement.
Yeah. At least we should try alternatives for the present situation, and we should not accept that governments or rulers or whatever kind of persons stop us if we want to try alternative ways of organizing ourselves. And At least I hear some kind of decentralized model for Geoism.
Yes, certainly. And I think that you are perfectly right that even if we may not have the possibility of saying what the absolutely best world would be like right now, I think that we could have a very strong degree of confidence in saying that we can improve upon the world compared to what it is like now. And that seems like a very, very good goal in thinking what could we do to improve the world, even if we are not sure what the exact global optimum would be.
And if we want to make the world a better place, we should probably have freedom to live how we prefer and more access to natural resources such as land. Let's find a way to fix this. Now I will ask a question that's a little bit more personal. Geoism offers perspective to all different kinds of people. Underpaid workers, people desperately looking for an affordable home, people who want to save our planet, people who are concerned about the decline of liberty, and people who just want to have a reasonable government instead of what we have now. What kind of lifestyle is your ideal in a Jewish society?
Well, thank you, Bart. I think that's a really fun question to try to imagine. What would your personal life be like if you lived in a more just world?
Yeah, how would you use your liberty?
I think that this is also interesting to reflect upon because I actually tend to be very happy with many aspects of my life today. I think that I already have a dream job since I greatly enjoy teaching and I greatly enjoy researching and reading about questions that I find both meaningful and intellectually stimulating. So I think that if I could imagine my perfect life in a just society, it would be that it to a stronger extent enables me to do things which I am already doing. I think that I am really, really fortunate in already being able to live a life that I see as really ideal for me. One very personal effect, though, is that the type of career I've decided to pursue is very competitive and with very little job security. So I think that you are automatically very vulnerable by pursuing this. And one thing which a Georgist institutional system would do would that it would provide more insurances for people who pursue these more risky types of careers or pursuits. So that is one thing which would certainly affect me greatly. It's interesting because my current job is trying to describe injustices and try to help us theorize how we as a society could remove these injustices. And then it becomes extra interesting to think about what I would do if we already removed these injustices, because then in one way the job I set up for myself would be completed. But I think that we will still have many different coordination problems surrounding our social environment. And I would probably be very happy in trying to figure out better ways for people to cooperate and work together rather than working against each other. So that's probably what I would hope to spend my time doing then.
Thank you. Is there any book or author that you especially would like to recommend to people interested in liberty?
One of my favorites is a libertarian philosopher called Rodrick Long, who has written a great many different pieces on this left-libertarian in the third sense literature. So he's not a Georgist, and he is quite skeptical of Georgism in some papers. But I think that he is a really, really intriguing thinker whom I would recommend. It's not in a particular single book I would recommend, but rather that he has written a large amount of shorter essays on a wide range of topics connected to this, which I think would be interesting to readers. I think that for book recommendations, I would have one which is more introductory and one which is perhaps a longer format. So partly I would recommend Markets Not Capitalism, which is an edited volume by Charles Johnson and Gary Chartier, which collects a number of essays in this radical libertarian tradition from Tucker's time and onto contemporary writings. And I think that the format of having these many short essays is quite appealing, and it has a lot of great content within it, which I would highly recommend. If you want a longer format for this, I could recommend Organization Theory by Kevin Carson, which is something like 600 pages of theory, but I think that it's extremely insightful in trying to map out the different ways in which our current economic system both reduces liberty and reduces equality, and how if these different privileges were removed, you would not only have a more free world, but also a more equal one.
Ah, great. Yeah. So, quite some homework for our listeners. Where should our listeners go to if they want to read some of your work?
Well, I think that they could find my thesis online, and that is definitely where I have written most extensively. So it is a book-length thesis under the title Land and Liberty on the Natural Monopoly of Violence. And I think that if you search for this title online, you'll find my university's digital archive called DIVA, and there you can download it in full text if you so want to. If you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter or X under @MARWJAC. So the first letters of Martin, W, first letters of Jacobson. And if you want to, you would be most welcome to send me an email on martin.jacobson@statsvet.uu.se.
And I will also include some links in the show notes. Martin, thank you very much for being here and explaining all these different aspects of liberty.
Thank you, Baron. It was my pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Still there? That's awesome. Please promote this podcast and tell your friends that Geoism is the way to go. My website is geoliberty.nl. Bye.